Welcome to Rethinking Communication. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore how we better connect with each other through the power of our words. For most of us, formal education left gaps in our ability to communicate well with each other, especially when trying to navigate conflict, inspire change, and overcome misunderstandings. I'm a former journalist, a speaking coach, and a communication expert, and my goal is to encourage you to rethink what it means to be an effective communicator, from the stage to the meeting room to the living room and everywhere in between. I welcome Neil Gordon to the show here in this episode. Neil is a speaking coach and a speaker himself, primarily focusing on storytelling and, in particular, persuasion. And that's what he and I spend a lot of our conversation talking about is how do you persuade others through communication? Neil's journey to appearing on this show is an interesting one in that, as you'll hear, communication was really educated out of Neil early on in his childhood. We talk about that and how it relates to a lot of the things you've heard me say on this show, which is we weren't taught to communicate well. And it often starts with communication being systematized and templatized in such a way that it takes the joy and nuance and complexity out of it. You'll hear about Neil's journey through several references to Disney and the theater. You'll hear Neil's journey and a return to a love of communication. And as I said, we get into persuasion, how he helps experts turn their message into a movement, and why he believes that communication is a way to ward off pessimism, skepticism about people and society, that the work that he does and the things that he and I share in this episode and in this conversation is a way to balance the cynical with the optimistic when it comes to all that we are facing in our society or all that it feels like we're facing these days. Enjoyed this conversation with Neil Gordon. You and I had a chance to connect before we actually got on this call today. And one of the things that you told me, Neil, was that school kind of educated you out of an interest in reading and communication. And I think that's a good place to start this conversation here. I got to know what you mean by that, how that actually happened, because that's something I talk a lot about here on this show is in a lot of ways, our education system failed us on how to communicate well. So, man, from your perspective, what do you mean by you were educated out of an interest in reading and communication?
I remember when I got my very first book report. It was in second grade. And my dad liked to joke he's now my late father, but when he was alive, he liked to joke that as soon as reading became work is when I lost all interest. Because I actually read quite a lot as a young child. Now, I was certainly helped along by the prominence of picture books at earlier ages.
Sure.
And it's possible that it was inevitable that I was going to take less interest in reading when there were fewer pictures. But this was a time before we had Magic Treehouse and A to Z Mysteries and those short roll doll books. What we had was like Beverly Cleary, Beezus and Ramona, that sort of thing, and
Yeah.
Roald Dahl's longer books like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And so when it came to reading those books and then having to prove that I read them and offer some kind of thoughts on the significance of having read them, where I wasn't just able to enjoy the story, then I just stopped doing it, period. I just stopped reading. I completed one book for leisure between the ages of 8 and 20. There was only one book I actually finished, and that was The Catcher in the Rye, senior year of high school, because a girl I had a crush on said, "You've never read Catcher in the Rye?" And so I did, just to say that I could, and she still didn't go out with me, but that's the way that sort of thing goes. Anyway, the point being that as soon as teachers were putting pressure on me to read and in a certain deadline, and they were increasingly more difficult books, my reading comprehension eroded away, and my brain just rebelled, and I just had no interest in any of it. And I got through all of public school and even college reading as little as possible.
Well, why is that significant for you? Why do you feel that's an important part of your story to let us know that, man, for that many years, reading wasn't a thing for you?
Part of it is just simply the communication based track that my career took shape on, as
Yeah.
in my first real job. I floated around as a temp and with dead end jobs for about 5 years after graduating for college. I was a theater major. I mean, I picked a major where I didn't have to do almost any reading and still didn't do the little reading I had to. And I floated around for 5 years, like I said, and then I just got a job as an editorial assistant at Penguin, where I worked on New York Times bestselling books and basically found a career path for me. And what happened in between the end of college and getting that job is I did discover reading when I moved to New York City. And there was this one book in particular I read. It was really just as a way to escape the subway. This is before smartphones. And so it was a lot harder to escape the New York City subway systems back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I just read A Prayer for Owen Meany by John Irving. I had seen this lame Hollywood version of that story from this movie called Simon Birch, which had very little to do with what actually happens in the book and the tone of the book. And because things, I mean, this is a spoiler alert, but things don't quite work out for the main character the way we would want them to.
Mm.
And so that shattered my worldview. And then I got super curious about how language could do that. And with all of the reading I did, I started to work like a detective to figure out what made some language and some writing and some communication more effective than others. And on the other side of that, I had viable enough skills to get an editorial job at one of the biggest publishers in the country.
What you just mentioned there, going back to your I guess disdain all those years of reading and ultimately communication, what was it about the fact that it had become something that you were taught, that you had to learn, that became almost systematized, that as you look back on it now, you can point to and say, "Oh yeah, that was what didn't sit right with me." Does that question make sense?
It certainly makes sense. And honestly, Michael, I've not thought of this situation or this topic in precisely this light, in this way. And so I appreciate the question very much. What it comes down to when we think about the kind of reading that not only I was doing, but any of us were doing when we were 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, is that this was reading as entertainment. I remember the book I actually had to do a book report on in second grade, and it was a novelization of the Disney cartoon 101 Dalmatians. And I think what really put me off when we think about this in the context of a feature length animated Disney film, Disney films are meant to be enjoyed. And in the most low hanging fruit sort of way, they took these often gruesome stories and turned them into these light, fluffy things.
Yeah.
And so Disneyfying something is something that happens to this day. And perhaps my brain didn't quite know how to reconcile that a lighthearted, fun loving Disney experience was going to have to become a thing that I toiled at, a thing that became slow and complicated and nuanced, at least nuanced for a 7-year old, and basically not really having any understanding. It was just perhaps just a foreign experience to take something so light and fun loving and turning it into something that was difficult and didn't immediately make sense and wasn't as immediately gratifying.
Hmm.
And so taking a 7-year-old who I was and trying to figure out what is it that I'm supposed to be thinking right now, as opposed to the immediately accessible nature of a Disney cartoon, it might have just short circuited something in my brain. It's possible that I wouldn't have had the same reaction if it was a non Disney narrative, but I was going for some sort of ease, and instead I got judged and assessed and criticized. I'm not saying that I did a terrible job in the book report. I don't even remember what grade I got on it. But having to prove myself in the context of something that's meant just to feel good,
Yeah.
it probably just made something not work right after that. And I rebelled in response.
I want to come back to that because that is incredibly important as we think about communication. So let's put a pin in that and come
Mhm,
back to that. Prayer for Own Meaning, that book by John
mhm.
Irving, I believe. What was it
Yes.
that connected with you there?
Because and it's funny, Disney is gonna probably become a prominent theme without me even meaning for it to. I had a very Hollywood, Disney, things are gonna work out in the end kind of sense of how the world works as a worldview coming out of college. I didn't know what I was gonna do for a living, and I didn't know how my life was gonna take shape, but I had this larger sense that it was gonna be fine. And with A Prayer for Owen Meany, the main character goes through this fantastic, and I mean fantastic as a quality of fantasy, a thing
Mhm.
that's supernatural, a thing that is so remarkable that it makes you challenge or question, do we really even know what is real and what is not? That kind of experience happens to him in his early 20s, but it flashes forward a number of times to when he's in his 40s and he's alone and bitter, and ed he's migrated from the United States to Canada, and he's constantly going to his pastor and complaining about, this is back in the 80s, complaining about what Ronald Reagan was doing, and the pastor was just ineffectually trying to tell him to stop worrying so much about the United States. He doesn't live there anymore and all of that. But he goes and complains to his pastor because he just doesn't really have many friends and doesn't really have, he certainly doesn't have a romantic partner. And it terrified me to think that that could happen at all, let alone that could happen to someone who was part of something so meaningful. That sort of thing would usually only happen to the secondary character who we don't really care about as much because they're not moral and upright and committed to a good life like the main character in our stories usually is.
Right, right.
In this case, that character was committed to all of those things and things don't work out for him. And I had a very hard time processing that. It was a hard idea to consider that even if I lived a good life or was part of something cool or interesting, that I could still wind up alone and angry and bitter. And it was just a lot for me to take. And it scared the crap out of me, honestly, Michael. I just was scared by the possibility of that.
Neil, yeah, it's a fiction book, right?
Yes, very much a novel.
Okay, so what was it about that fear that sparked in you curiosity and not perhaps the other way that you could have gone? And this is making perhaps a false duality here, but why
Hmm.
spark curiosity versus shutdown? Or or
Right.
even that it affected you at all, that you just put it aside and be like, "Ah, that's not gonna happen to me." Like, why what sparked the curiosity there, out of that fear that you just talked about?
It's a good question. And it's kind of funny. Do you remember speak I promise I didn't plan this, Michael. This is another Disney reference. I didn't spend my entire life consuming Disney content,
I'm
although now
questioning
that I'm
it
looking
now.
back. The when we think about the cartoon version of Beauty and the Beast,
Yeah.
it's a short hour and 15, hour and 20-minute movie, whatever it is, and then it gets adapted into a Broadway musical back in the 90s. And I was a real musical theater geek in my teen years because musical theater was the only way I felt like I belonged in it to anything, was when we did the musicals in high school and all of that. And so I listened to all sorts of show tunes at that time in my life. Let me be very clear to our listeners and viewers, I do not anymore. And the Beauty and the Beast Broadway soundtrack has Belle and the Beast enjoying a book together. And it's a version of the Arthurian legend. It's King Arthur, it's a young Arthur pulling the sword from the stone.
Mm.
And the beast suddenly exclaims, "Oh, that must mean he's king." And she's like, "Wait and see." And then, of course, she finishes the story, and he goes, "I didn't know books could do that. Do what? Take me away from who I am and what I am." And I'm actually a little disturbed, Michael, that I remember as much of this as I do, considering how many years ago it was.
I'm impressed here, Neil. I'm impressed.
I promise that I haven't listened to this. It's not a problem if you listen to show tunes. I want to be very clear about that. I just don't do that anymore. Anyway, I'm more of a classic rock dude. Anyway, he was transported. While I experienced a transportation of these books I loved as a young child, Prayer for Owen Meany was the first time I was legitimately transported by a book since I was probably about 6, 7, or 8 years old. I had read some stuff, but it didn't reach me because reading was always an assignment. It was always just to be approved of or to be told that I got a good grade or whatever. It didn't have anything to do with me. It had to do with my fulfillment of an arbitrary system. And so when A Prayer from Amini comes along and I have this fear, what I believe happened is that even though it was a negative experience, feeling all of that fear and struggle around this character with whom I felt a great investment, I would say that the curiosity came from the fact that I had been numb for so much of my life. I had been numb. I had used movies and TV as a way to escape a difficult childhood with parents yelling at each other all the time and the bullying and the all of the terrible things that can happen to a kid. This was the first time that a book had helped me to have a legitimately emotionally significant experience, and was one of only a couple of emotionally significant experiences I had gotten from any kind of entertainment, like a movie or a TV show, because I was so numb. So that when something actually reached me and compelled me to feel something more than what I had felt or experienced to that point in my life, I feel like I was just blessed with the curiosity innately because this feels like something. And again, I was 22, 23. I didn't really know what it was, but
Mhm.
on some level, it's like, this is something that I need to investigate. And maybe I'll find a path in order to, again, didn't consciously think this, but on some unconscious level, I thought maybe there's a way to feel again. Maybe there's a way to tune back into my life and reclaim it. And maybe books can help me to do that.
Hmm. Okay, so now I want to go back to that pin that we dropped earlier and kind of maybe
Mm,
thread together the things that I'm hearing and sensing. So this that aversion to reading when it became systematized. I'm curious, as a speaking and communications coach, one of the things that I come up
right.
against is very few people feel like they don't communicate well. Like speaking
Mm,
and talking is just so much a part of
yeah.
what we do and how we interact with others in the world that very few of us take a step back and say, I don't know if I'm as effective in that communication as possible. And so so we all just think we're good at it. And the
Mhm.
idea of working on communication, working on being a more effective storyteller, working on being uh, caring about how language can affect us, whether it's the written word in books or whether it is the
Mhm.
spoken word in a lot of the work that you and I do.
Mhm.
It feels like in the same way that systematizing reading for you was met with an averse reaction, bringing up the idea that, man, not a lot of us communicate well, and it's actually something we should work on, brings up similar feelings of aversion in others. Do you get the sense that that is the case with the work that you do now? And I want to get into the work that you do, but yeah, just your take on that observation. I would love it.
I'm going to get a little vulnerable here, Michael, because when you look me up and you look up, let's say, my articles on entrepreneur, I had a lot of, I don't contribute to them right now, but for a time, I contributed a fair number of articles, and almost all of them wound up in the top 5 most viewed and consumed articles. But I had a few number 1 articles, and the one that was best performing and remained at number 1 was how to craft an elevator pitch that gives people chills in under 20 seconds. And I guess the headline just really attracted some people because of the immediacy of that content, apparently. Anyway, it was number 1 for good 3 or 4 days, and the vulnerability that I mentioned a moment ago is that no matter what I say, whether I follow my own advice or someone else's advice on describing one's work or providing some kind of unique value proposition, almost no one is ever honestly interested in what I do. And my take on what I, and maybe this is your experience too, I don't know. But to go back to your original question there, my theory, because of your question, quite honestly, Michael, is that people might not be interested in something to do with messaging or persuasion or communication because they feel, well, okay, I'm going to amend that. People might not be interested in messaging and communication because they feel that they do that fine enough. And it's not in a marketing sense, it's not a bleeding neck kind of problem. But then things started to shift when I started to talk about how I'm an expert in persuasion, because at least that aroused some curiosity. Because while communication as a broader lens might not be something people feel they need help on, what I do sense is that people get where there's a gap in persuading others of things in particular.
What is it about persuading others that captures our attention in the way that you described versus
Mm-hmm.
what would it mean to you to communicate well with others? What would it mean to you to be a more effective in communicating your
Mm-hmm.
ideas and opinions to others, or sharing that, or bringing about greater understanding? What is it about persuasion that makes us perk our ears up in that same way that those articles, when your messaging started to become more about persuasion?
Mm.
What have you experienced that gets us, "Ooh, I like that. Ooh, that sounds good. That sounds like something I wanna do."
That's interesting. Or at the very least, arouses curiosity.
It arouses
Here's
curiosity,
what I
yeah.
here's what I think, Michael. When we think about communication, communication exists as a highly amorphous and even nebulous aspect of daily life. To your point, everyone, not everyone, but a lot of people think of themselves as decent or even good communicators because they do it every day.
Yeah,
You could have a CEO of a company who doesn't feel they have a problem with communication because they get in front of their employees and talk at them every day, or they write an email every week to everyone, and so on and so forth. Oh, no, I don't really need help with that. I have that covered. I do this, I do that, and so on and so forth, because communication is a thing that happens every day. It's therefore difficult to assign a concreteness to it, a
right.
value proposition to a thing that already happens. Whereas, in contrast, when we think about persuasion, persuasion is easier to assign a binary quality to it. Either we persuade somebody of something or we don't. Either we get our way or we don't. Either we make a sale or we don't. We get a yes or a no in many situations, not exclusively. There's some nuance and gray areas around persuasion as well. However, there is a greater capacity to imagine whether a thing in the past has been successful or not when we think about persuasion as opposed to communication,
Yeah.
because persuasion is about Yes, this person bought, or no, they didn't. Yes, this person shared my video, or no, they didn't. Yes, I got 10 million views on my TED Talk, or no, I didn't. And when you can assign that kind of binary quality to it, you have the opportunity to have a more concrete relationship to it. And that concreteness of relationship is possibly what makes people perk up and think, ooh, that's something I'd like to learn about.
I think that's a really, really keen observation there, Neil. I think you're
Mm.
onto something there, man. It's almost like
Cool question, though. I
you've
appreciate
explored
you.
this before.
I haven't thought about this.
Okay.
Michael, I've not actually had that thought process until you asked me about it. So I very much appreciate the dialogue because of what it's helping us both to understand.
Yeah. I think you're onto something there, man. I want to ask this, and I hate asking a should question, but I don't know another way to word it right now. Should persuasion be our goal? When we talk about an
Mm,
interaction with another human being, and yes, there are places where you used a couple times there the example of the salesperson trying to make a deal. They're obviously trying to
mhm,
elicit some sort of behavior. But
mhm.
are we effective if we go into a conversation or utilize our communication skills with persuasion being the goal?
I would actually, and I'll have another pop culture reference that's not Disney for once.
Hey.
I'll have yeah, I mean, I'm growing here, Michael. I'm growing into my adulthood over the
We're
span of our
exploring
conversation.
uncharted territory here.
Yeah, well, it's crazy. I personally don't believe that persuasion is the definitive goal, as in so much as I believe positive impact, growth, meaningful results for as many people as possible, and as peaceful and harmonious of a life as we can strive for as these unpredictable animals wandering around on a great
Hmm.
big spherical rock. I don't believe definitively that persuasion always needs to be the goal.
Yeah.
Now, what's the pop culture reference that I was referring to? Have you ever seen the movie My Cousin Vinny?
Yes, sir.
You remember that movie? Okay.
I
For
do.
our listeners, and viewers who have not seen it, which I feel sorry for you if you haven't, it's these two boys from New York City who get mistakenly prosecuted for murdering someone in the Deep South. And Vinny, played by Joe Pesci, comes down as a freshly made lawyer from Brooklyn to get these boys, get them the not guilty verdict, to get them off the hook, save them from being electrocuted by the
Yeah.
chair and all of that. So that's the premise. And well, I'm going to ruin the ending because it's making the larger point. Law and winning a case is a very clear, very objective, and binary example of persuasion, where the prosecution and the defense are both trying to persuade the jury of voting for their outcome. And at the end, because of the case that Joe Pesci's character as Vinny creates, the prosecutor, played by, I believe, Lane somebody, another Southerner like with everyone else. And he says, in light of these testimonies that we just heard, the state would like to dismiss all charges. When we think about a district attorney's office and an assistant DA whose purpose is to win cases and the agenda that they have to win as many cases as possible to possibly become DA or possibly become a congressperson or whatever it is, a lot of prosecutors like to go into politics. They look at their record as the main thing that they are there to serve and protect.
Sure.
And think about a prosecutor, and that's a fictional example, but think about a person who understands that this defendant or these defendants are absolutely not the people we're looking for. They are innocent. We need to honor that. In that regard, persuasion is not the goal. The pursuit of truth is the goal. The more harmonious life where law-abiding citizens are kept out of prison or not electrocuted, and we honor the potential and positivity of any given and liberty of any given person's life. This feels like a thing worth striving for more globally and more definitively than persuasion. What if you're in a situation and the other person persuades you of something
Mm-hmm.
and you rethink your position and you let go of the argument and you say, you know what? I agree with you. You're right. I'm going to go and do this differently because you persuaded me. So for that person, persuasion is no longer the goal. Listening becomes the goal. Considering, being curious, receiving a different idea. These are all worthy goals that, so as we've talked it through, Michael, always having persuasion as a goal scares the crap out of me. Honestly, dude, that would be a very dangerous place to live in, quite honestly.
I've been bouncing this idea around people of we so often look at persuasion or some affecting some sort of change as I've got to get
Mm-hmm.
you to change your belief, your action, your behavior,
Mm-hmm.
your mindset from this to this. And like you've talked about, a binary. You once were this and now you're this. You once believed this and now you
Mm-hmm.
believe this. To me, what if the change is simply you now come out of conversation with a greater understanding and a more clearer picture of what's happening? To your point, and I love how you put it, you now come to a closer definition of the truth,
Mm-hmm.
capital T truth,
Right.
rather than just your truth in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
That can be a change too. That can be a persuasion too. Can it not?
Yeah, and it certainly can. And one of the things that I'm sure you also find in your work as well is that with communication, there's so many nuances. There are no definitive hard and fast rules to any of this,
Of
and we can
course.
we can codify
Yes.
it and assign structure as much as we want. And ultimately, so honestly, you could ask anything, and I would probably say sure, which is what I'm saying here. It's like there's always room for
Yeah.
everything in the world of in discussion and dialogue around communication. And and so yeah, I absolutely do see that as a possibility.
So now I want to get into tactically the work that you do. I mean, in helping
Mm,
create a more compelling, more momentum shifting message for people, including persuasive communication. How do we
mhm.
go about that? How do we become a more persuasive person in how we speak? How do we leverage our ideas in such a way and present them in such a way that creates positive momentum for people? What is the work that you're doing with folks?
A number of years ago, I live in New York City now, but when I lived in Los Angeles, I volunteered at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, where I would read to kids bedside, and I used my theater background to get give very over the top readings. Speaking, I mentioned Roald Dahl earlier. One of my favorite things to do is to do this really bad British accent of characters in his books because they're very British books. And so, is Mr. Willy Wonka really the most clever chocolate maker in all the world? And all of that. And so that was my jam. And once a week, I would go to the hospital and do that with the kids and staying there, and we'd gift books to them and all of that. And it's this wonderful program, a program cool enough that a random dude like me can go into a hospital room and just do these ridiculous readings of books. Well, the founder of that program was also my supervisor, my volunteer supervisor, essentially. And I go in for my shift one day, and she's all flustered because she has to give a 10-minute presentation on the program to a bunch of people visiting the hospital later that day. And she was dreading this because usually when she gives talks, people just glaze over, ooh, another bunch of information about kids struggling in a hospital. And they would just politely clap at the end. And that was it. And I would dread that kind of speaking too, if that's all that ever happened.
Yeah.
Well, I found out from someone else that she was fretting and nervous. And so I went up to her and said, hey, would you like some help in what to say later? And she said, yes. And so we work out what she's going to say, and she goes and gives her talk. And I see her later that afternoon. I asked her how it went. And she said this time they were held rapt at attention from the moment she started speaking. And rather, at the end, instead of them politely clapping, a bunch of them rushed her to give them their business cards. And one of them even invited her to apply for a grant.
Hmm.
That transformation from people bored out of their minds to rushing, excuse me, I beg your pardon. That transformation from bored out of their minds to rushing her with business cards was the result of her and I speaking about her talk for all of 2 minutes. In 2 minutes, we completely transformed her presence as a speaker. Now, of course, what was done in those 2 minutes? The truth is that I just gave her a high level idea of structure about how she could redo it. Start with a story, do this, do that. But the real thing to learn about here, to circle back to your original question about being more persuasive and the kind of tactical tools and strategies we can utilize, is that prior to that day, we had a 2 minute conversation because we had already worked out a certain persuasion technique for her program because she had appeared on TV a few weeks earlier. And so I met with her for a couple of hours and we worked out a certain technique that she was then not only able to use on TV in a little bit of like a soundbite kind of answer, because she had just 20 or 30 seconds basically to answer a question in the segment she was in. But then we were able to take that same technique and make it the basis of a 10-minute talk. And that's what gave us the clarity and the confidence to redo and restructure everything in such a short amount of time. And it's a technique that's showed up for the last 2,500 years. And we see it from some of the most famous thought leaders and authors and experts, some of the most viewed TED speakers, and on and on and on. It just changes. It just changes how people receive information. It just changes how people believe in the different possibility of what they're capable of. Now, what is it?
Yeah,
In the
you're
art of
you're I gotta know. I'm on the edge of my seat
edge of
here.
your seat, right? And that's by the way, let's put a pin in the edge of your seat thing, because that's another thing I want to make sure our listeners and viewers know about. When we look at, let's say, The Art of War by Sun Tzu, he wrote this 2,500 years ago. He's an ancient Chinese military strategist. And on line 18 of the first chapter, he says, all of warfare is based on deception. He has other lines that get quoted and stuff like that, like feign disorder and then crush your opponent, that sort of thing. All these little mini examples of deceiving your opponent so as to win at war. But with that one sentence, all of warfare is based on deception, he gives us the recipe for how to win at war, period. If you want to win at war, it's not because you have the biggest army. It's not because you have the most advanced weaponry or the most material resources. It's because of your ability to deceive your opponent that you are able to win at war. And in doing that, he distills what is an entire book's worth of content down to a single idea. And so when I mentioned earlier that there was an article that I wrote for Entrepreneur that went to #1 on how to craft an elevator pitch that gives people chills in under 20 seconds, it's because in that article, I'm teaching people to strategically build up to a single sentence recipe for future success. The silver bullet is what I call it. And in creating this, using this persuasion technique, whether it's in your elevator pitch or a 3-minute TV segment, or writing a full length speech or a TED talk, or writing a book, when you distill everything down to this one technique, it suddenly plants this powerful seed of possibility in the minds of the reader or listener. They suddenly get it. You say all of warfare is based on deception, and you could be like a military, like a colonel about to lose your battle because the other army is so much bigger than yours, and someone can come up and say all of warfare is based on deception, and they're like, ooh, deception. What if I sent my cavalry into the forest and had them come up from behind and surprise attack them? One sentence could start giving you ideas. You're suddenly empowered. And with that sudden empowerment, you are able to have ideas, but more significantly, and to circle back to the original question of how are we more persuasive? Persuasion is all about convincing others that change is possible. People will buy your stuff. People will buy when they believe change is possible. They buy or buy in. I'm not just talking about material gain. I'm talking about a TED talk that's persuasive or an elevator pitch that's persuasive. You convince others that change is possible, then they're going to be much more interested in learning from you, in getting your stuff, in following you, in whatever the call to action might be.
What did that lady at the hospital, do you remember her single sentence that you
Of
you worked
course.
on her? What was it?
Of course. What most people see when it comes to staying in a hospital, the healing modalities that people think of are surgery and medicine and even lifestyle changes, alternative modalities like acupuncture if the physician is more progressively minded. We have this idea that there are these certain things that can really be particularly powerful when helping a patient to resolve their maladies. And the story that my client told at the beginning of her talk was about how a young boy who was pretty close to the end of his life, and there was a darkness and a heaviness in the room when she visited this boy and his family. And then she read him a book, and it shifted the entire vibe around. Like they all huddled around and they listened to the story. And for that moment, it wasn't a room filled with darkness anymore. In fact, he actually pulled through for a while after that night, no matter how, despite how close he was. And with that and many other stories she can tell about the power of books in a hospital-like environment, her silver bullet was simply literacy can heal.
Hmm.
And so when somebody heard that day in that little 10-minute presentation, they didn't just get a recipe for how to make a hospital work better. Even if they had no interest in children struggling in hospitals, which I hope is nobody out there, but let's say somebody was particularly cynical, they didn't need to think about that sentence and that idea in the context of a hospital. If they had their own child who never settled down to go to sleep and was hyperactive and all of that, literacy can heal. Oh, literacy. What if I started reading to my child more before bedtime and gradually got them to settle down by increasingly calmer books? Met met him where he's at, and then after 4 books, get him to the point where he's really settled down and ready to go to sleep. That would be a very healing thing to happen. And if all they got from that 10-minute presentation was that idea about their stuff, their situation, that's a really powerful 3 words. That's a really good recipe for them to take and not bad for a single sentence.
Neil, I gotta know, how does that sentence land with you? With everything that you described in our early part of this conversation,
Mm.
how does literacy can heal land with you?
Oh, I love that question, Michael. Thank you for that. Let's see here. It would have been in the end of 1999 or the beginning of 2000 when I read A Prayer for Owen Meany. And I went through a very dark, angsty, what's it all mean, atheist kind of time, which was very lonely. And within a couple of years of that, by the fall of 2003, I had a realization for myself that just fundamentally in life, there has to be a better way than what I was going through. And I started, because I was a reader, I started reading books about personal growth and I started taking workshops. And I started learning about all these different modalities and all these different things that could potentially help me. But more significantly, I believe that the curiosity and inquiry that was prompted by A Prayer for Owen Meany put me on a path that I could contend with the very complex trauma that I experienced growing up because of the household I grew up in. And even as recently as the last couple of years, when I've immersed myself in certain therapeutic modalities and really let go of some of the deepest and darkest wounds that I experienced growing up, I have to look at the sentence literacy can heal and see myself as one of the best embodiments of that idea that I've ever known. It started with the inquiry, and then it led to, in 2003, a decision to heal. I didn't know what it looked like at the time. I was like, there has to be a better way than the way I'm living. And here we are, more than 20 years later. I'm still on that journey,
Yeah.
but I certainly feel better than I did back then.
I love that. Gosh, that's wonderful. I love that it comes full circle for you in that moment. I
Mm,
love I love the tactful advice there that you gave to find that silver bullet or that single sentence, as I
mm,
believe you put it, that serves as a recipe for future success. I also loved, and I wrote down, and I want to highlight here. You said persuasion is all about convincing others that change is possible. Not that you want to change them, like we talked about earlier, but just convincing them that it's even possible. I
yeah.
appreciate that perspective, Neil. What's a question that you wished you were asked more about all this?
Hmm. I admittedly have struggled over the years with a perceived lack of curiosity in others about what it is I do, as I've alluded to earlier when talking about communication as this somewhat nebulous topic.
Yeah.
And I wish that more people queued me up to ask me, why do I think this kind of work matters? Why is this important to you? Or why is this important to any of us? Not from a place of skepticism, but just tell me, what is it about this that matters so much?
You queued me up, I'm going to cue you. Why does this matter, Neil?
Okay.
Why does this matter?
I admittedly operate from a fairly pessimistic place in a lot of my life when I see the headlines and I see the way things are happening, and I know the potential of any given human and how rarely that's realized. And I alluded earlier to the edge of your seat kind of technique. And
Mhm.
what I believe is that it's very important to create emotional connection with an audience in public speaking and to meet them at an emotional level and draw them in. And I tend to help my clients to do this with anticipation. How to plant a mystery at the beginning of your talk. How did this happen? How was this possible? And then people lean in, it's like, how did that happen? How was that possible? And then they're invested and they're putting away their phones. And I really value that anticipatory thing. And then you can build up to a silver bullet as a climactic moment in a talk. With all of that said, I do all of that because I tend to believe less in where people are at the beginning of a talk or when they don't know about something yet. I tend to believe that people are skeptics and full of doubt and disinterested and not naturally curious. And it's hard to contend with
Yeah.
sometimes. However, why this work matters is because built into it is, like, let's look at the anatomy of a talk. It might start with believing less in any given audience member, but why even bother doing it then? Because I believe people want to be inspired. They want to be influenced in a meaningful and positive way. They want to create meaningful change in their lives and enjoy better lives as a result. So my work matters because while on the surface it feels a bit cynical, inherently it's optimistic.
Mm.
Inherently it believes people want meaningful change. And I see this work as a really powerful reminder of that.
I got to agree, Neil.
Yeah.
I think everything we talked about up to this point underscores that point. So, man, thank you
Yep.
so much for having the conversation, for going to some places that hopefully we're a little bit revealing for you. But man, thank you so much for sharing your perspective on the show, man. Thank you so much. Absolutely.
It's been a pleasure, Michael.